Robert's Rebellion, also known as the War of the Usurper, was a rebellion against House Targaryen. It lasted close to a year and resulted in the end of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms and the beginning of Robert Baratheon's reign. In 281 AC, a grand tourney was held by Lord Walter Went at Harrenhal. Many nobles from all over the Seven Kingdoms came to the Riverlands to take part in the festivities. Amongst them were the heir to Winterfell, Brandon Stark, and his younger siblings Eddard, Lyanna, and Benjen. The most prominent visitor of the tourney was King Aerys II Targaryen. Aerys had not left the Red Keep for many years, ever since his half-year capture during the Defiance of Duskendale in 277 AC, but he was inspired to come to the tourney by words from his master of whisperers, the eunuch Varys. The tourney was cause for great celebration, as spring had come to Westeros, or so they had thought. In addition, all of the Kingsguard had gathered to welcome their newest member, Sir Jaime Lannister. However, the tourney's ending was a little less joyful. After winning the final tilt, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen was to crown the new Queen of Love and Beauty. Instead of crowning his wife, the Dornish Princess Elia Martell, Rhaegar rode past her and crowned Lyanna Stark of Winterfell instead. Eddard would later recall that this moment, at the end of the coming year, the moment when all Lyanna Stark was abducted by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen near Harrenhal. Her brother Brandon Stark was on his way to Riverrun to wed Catelyn Tully. When the news reached him, Brandon rode at once to King's Landing with his companions Ethan Glover and Brandon's squire Albert Arryn, nephew to Lord Jon Arryn and the heir of the Eyrie. Brandon rode for the Red Keep, and outside its gates, unaware that Rhaegar was not present, shouted for him to come out and die. King Aerys II had them all arrested for plotting the murder of the crown prince, and summoned the fathers of all those who stood accused to court. Lord Rickard Stark, who had been on his way south with the wedding party for Brandon's wedding, went to King's Landing with 200 men. None of them returned north. In King's Landing, all of those who stood accused were executed, with the sole exception of Ethan Glover. King Aerys did allow for trials of a sort. Lord Rickard Stark demanded a trial by combat, and the king granted his request. He dressed for battle, but Aerys declared Fire to be the champion of House Targaryen. He had Rickard suspended from the rafters in the throne room, where his pyromancers, Rosart amongst them, kindled a blaze beneath the Lord of Winterfell. Brandon was brought in as well and placed in a Tyroshi strangling device, while a longsword was placed just outside his reach. He was allowed to try and free his father, but the more he struggled to reach the sword, the tighter the cord around his neck became. He strangled himself in an attempt to reach his sword and save his father, while Lord Rickard cooked in his armor. Next, Aerys demanded that Lord Jon Arryn send him the heads of Robert Baratheon of Storm's End and Eddard Stark, now the Lord of Winterfell after the deaths of his father and older brother. Robert and Eddard were Jon's wards at the Eyrie, and Jon raised his banners in revolt, and this act is seen as the start of the Robert's Rebellion, which would last close to a year. Fighting in Robert's Rebellion began in the Vale of Arryn. Though Jon Arryn called for all of his banners, not all of his bannermen sided with him. There were those who sided with the king, among them Mark Grafton. Grafton called the other loyalists to aid him in barring the rebels from entering the port of Galltown. With the port blocked, Eddard Stark decided to make his own way back to the north by crossing the Mountains of the Moon to the Fingers, where he would need to find a fisherman to carry him across the Bight. Once north, Eddard could call his banners. Galltown's defenses eventually fell after an unknown amount of time, with Robert Baratheon slaying Mark Grafton in the taking of Galltown. Robert sailed to Storm's End to call his own banners as well. Just as not all the lords in the Vale had sided with Jon Arryn, not all the lords in the Stormlands sided with Robert Baratheon. The first major battle in the Stormlands took place at Summerhall. They were 3 battles in truth, and all fought in one day. Lords Grandison, Catherine, and Fell had gathered their hosts and planned to join forces at Summerhall. From there, they would march on Storm's End. However, Thanks to an informer, Robert learned of their plans and their plot and rode with his knights and squires to Summerhall, where he attacked each host in turn. Robert ended up killing Lord Fell in battle. Lord Catherine and Grandison, as well as Lord Fell's son Silveraxe, were taken captive and brought to Storm's End, when Robert returned there after the battles for unknown reasons. There, Robert turned his enemies into his friends and allies, as both Lords Grandison and Catherine, as well as Silveraxe, would later be loyal to Robert. Following this victory at Summerhall, Robert was now free to march north to join up with Jon Arryn and the Northmen. The next major battle was the Battle of Ashford. Robert marched out, leaving his younger brother Stannis in charge of Storm's End. At Ashford, Lord Randall Tarley fell upon Robert's forces. Lord Randall was the first of the Loyalists to arrive, and with his van defeated Robert's forces before Lord Mace Tyrell could arrive with the main force from the Reach. Despite the fact that it had been Randall's victory, Mace Tyrell takes credit for the victory. The battle is also considered to be indecisive, but during the battle, Lord Catherine was cut down by Randall Tarley, who sent his head to King Aerys II. Robert managed to escape capture with the bulk of his forces to join his strength with Lord Ned Stark and Lord Jon Arryn. Following the battle, Mace Tyrell marched on Storm's End and laid siege to the castle. King Aerys, due to the events in the Stormlands, came to believe that his Hand of the King, Lord Owen Merryweather, was ineffectual. The king was even considering that Merryweather might have been so ineffectual as to possibly aiding Robert's rebellion. In result, Owen was stripped of his lands and titles and was later exiled. Lord John Connington, a friend of Rhaegar's, with a reputation of a warrior, was named as hand in Owen's stead. The Battle of the Bells. Ned Stark had reached Winterfell, where he called his banners. He marched south with these forces and joined up with Jon Arryn. Together they negotiated with Hoster Tully, the Lord of Riverrun, for his support. Lord John Connington led a mighty army into the field. The forces he commanded gave chase, and Robert's march became a grueling one. Robert, wounded through unknown means, eventually took refuge at Stony Sept, which would become the site of the Battle of the Bells, the first major battle known to have taken place in 283 AC. John Connington's forces took the town by force and began to search every house. The residents of the town were actively helping Robert, however, and despite the search, they offered pardons and rewards the threats and the hostages Connington took and hung in crow cages. They could never find Robert. The battle began when Lord Stark and Tully arrived with a rebel army. The soldiers fought in the streets and alleys and on the rooftops, and the Septons rang the bells to warn the residents to lock their doors. The battle was fierce, and John Connington managed to wound Hoster Tully and kill Jon Arryn's cousin, Sir Denys Arryn. Eventually, Robert came out of the Peach, the brothel in which he had been hiding, and fought with Connington, almost killing him. Suspicious of the loss at Stony Sept, King Aerys exiled John Connington, stripping him of his titles. Aerys began to realize that Robert was the greatest threat to his dynasty since Daemon I Blackfyre, and he named Lord Charlton Chelstead as his Hand of the King in Connington's stead. Sir Jonathan Darry and Sir Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard were sent to rally Connington's men, while their Lord Commander Sir Gerald Hightower was sent by King Aerys to find Rhaegar Targaryen. The Crown Prince finally returned from the south and convinced Aerys to ask Tywin Lannister for help, just as the rebels had or would do at one point. Aerys commanded his alchemists to place caches of wildfire on multiple locations in King Landing. With both Albert Arryn and Denys Arryn now dead, Jon was in need of an heir. Hoster Tully swiftly betrothed his brother Lysa, who had previously proven fertile to Jon, and in a double ceremony at Riverrun, Ned and Jon Arryn married Hoster's daughters Catelyn and Lysa, respectively. The Battle of the Trident. After first refusing to send aid to Aerys, both due to his caution as well as due to his anger over Elya's treatment, Prince Doran Martell agreed to send 10,000 Dornishmen to strengthen the army Prince Rhaegar was gathering. Aerys sent Prince Lewin Martell, Doran's uncle, to take command of these forces, but also threatened him by stating that he held Princess Elia Martell, Prince Rhaegar's wife, and their two young children, Rhaenys and Aegon, hostage. The Battle of the Trident was a decisive battle in the war. It was fought in 283 AC between the Loyalists and the rebels, and it took place on a known as the Ruby Ford since the battle, located on the northern bank of the Trident, where Rhaegar tried to cross the river. The Loyalists had 40,000 men, while the army of the rebels numbered fewer men, but the men were more battle-hardened. Rhaegar and Lord Robert Baratheon met in single combat with the battle raging on around them. Rhaegar managed to wound Robert before Robert killed Rhaegar with a blow to the chest from his warhammer. Eventually, the Targaryen host broke and ran. Around the time of the battle, Robert proclaimed his intention to claim the Iron Throne. Out of all three leaders of the rebellion, Robert had the best claim, due to the fact that his grandmother had been Princess Rhael Targaryen, the youngest daughter of King Aegon V Targaryen. To justify his claim, the Maesters would later use his blood ties to House Targaryen, though it was the conquest which eventually won him the throne. The battle at the Mander. Quaelon Greyjoy, the Lord of the Iron Islands at the time, desired neutrality for the Ironborn during the war. After Pike was informed of Rhaegar's death, Quaelon was convinced by his eldest sons, Balon, Euron, and Victarion, to join the rebels as soon as possible, or else lose all chance at the spoils of war. Since it was still unknown whether House Lannister of Casterly Rock would side with the Loyalists or the rebels, most of the Iron Man's fleet remained at home while Quaelon led 50 longships in attacking the Reach. The Greyjoys captured some ships and raided some towns and villages. They were intercepted by the longships of Shield Island at the mouth of the Mander. After Lord Quaelon was slain in the Battle of the Mander, his heir, Balon, led the remaining Iron Man back to the Iron Islands, having accomplished little. Already prior to the Battle of the Trident, King Aerys had been preparing his wildfire plot. His hand of the king, Lord Qualton Chalstead, eventually became suspicious of the frequency with which the pyromancer visited the king. When he discovered the king's wildfire plot, he attempted to change the king's mind, and when nothing worked, he chose to resign this position. For this, Aerys had him burned alive. Following the Trident, Aerys named Rossart, his favorite pyromancer, as his new hand of the king. He would only be hand for a fortnight. Meanwhile, Aerys sent his wife Queen Rhaella and his new heir, their second son, Prince Viserys, to Dragonstone for safety, where they would have the protection of, amongst others, Sir Willem Darry, the Master-at-Arms of the Red Keep and the royal fleet. Aerys refused to allow Rhaegar's wife, Princess Elia Martell, and their children Rhaenys and Aegon to leave the city, keeping them by his side instead. While the Trident is seen by many as the decisive battle of the war, the capital remained untaken until the sack of King's Landing in 283 AC, the last major battle of the war. Because Robert Baratheon had been injured in battle, Lord Ned Stark and his army pursued the remnants of Rhaegar's army who had fled back to the capital. Tywin Lannister, who had refused calls to arms from both sides at that point, appeared at the gates of King's Landing with an army of 12,000 men, hours before Eddard Stark would arrive. Lord Tywin professed his loyalty to King Aerys, and while Lord Varys counseled Aerys to keep the gates locked, the king chose to listen to Grand Maester Parcell and open the gates to Tywin's men. Once inside, the forces from the Westerlands began to sack the city. Upon the realization that all was lost, Aerys ordered Rossart to ignite the wildfire caches throughout the city, wishing to leave Robert nothing but, quote, ashes and bones. He ordered Sir Jaime Lannister, Tywin's eldest son and the only knight of the Kingsguard present in the city, to kill Tywin and bring his head to Aerys. Instead, Jaime killed Rossart, and upon the realization that Aerys would simply give the order to burn the city down to another pyromancer, he returned to the Red Keep and took care of Aerys himself in the throne room. Meanwhile, Sir Gregor Clegane and Sir Amory Lorch had entered Maegor's holdfast to deal with the rest of the royal family, to secure the throne for Robert, and to prove that House Lannister had forsaken the Targaryens. Gregor killed Prince Aegon Targaryen, Rhaegar's son and heir, in front of the child's mother, Princess Elia Martell, and then raped and murdered her, with Aegon's blood and brains still on his hands. Amory dragged Princess Rhaenys Targaryen from under her father's bed and killed her, stabbing her. And when Ned arrived in the city, he found Jaime seated on the Iron Throne and Aerys' corpse slumped below it. Robert arrived in the city at a later point, upon which he was presented with the bodies of Elia, Rhaenys, and Aegon by Lord Tywin. Robert was pleased by this, but Eddard called it murder of children. This resulted in an argument between Ned and Robert, and Ned rode out alone in anger to fight the final battles of the war in the south. In the days that followed the sack of King's Landing, Jaime Lannister sought out and killed Gargus and Baelys, the remaining two pyromancers aware of the wildfire plot. The aftermath of Robert's rebellion is considered to have ended at the sack of King's Landing. Not all battles were fought, and in the south the siege of Storm's End continued, while Lyanna Stark was still missing. The siege of Storm's End had begun after the Battle of Ashford, and Lord Mace Tyrell had led his forces to Storm's End, where they had laid siege to the castle for the better part of a year. Storm's End was being held by Stannis Baratheon. While the castle garrison was starving and ate rats to survive, the forces of the Reach feasted inside of the castle. A smuggler named Davos managed to sail past the blockade of the Red Wine fleet and sell his cargo of onions and fish to the residents of Storm's End, preventing them from resorting to cannibalism. The new food supply allowed Storm's End to hold out long enough until Ned could arrive from King's Landing to lift the siege. The Lords of the Reach were quick to dip their banners. Following the conclusion of the rebellion, Robert was successfully installed as the new Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. Robert named his foster father Jon Arryn as his Hand of the King, and he named his middle brother Stannis as Lord of Dragonstone. Robert had no wish to marry following the death of his betrothed Lyanna Stark, but Jon convinced him otherwise by informing Robert that the realm was in need of an heir. Jon suggested that Lord Tywin marry his daughter Cersei, as the marriage would ensure Tywin's support should Viserys ever attempt to win his throne back. Robert and Cersei married in 284 AC, and Maester Yandel described the marriage as Robert's first act as king. The deaths of Princess Elia Martell and her two young children, Rhaenys and Aegon Targaryen, infuriated House Martell. Prince Oberyn, Elia's younger brother, attempted to raise Dorne for the exiled Viserys. Messages were sent by both Raven and Messenger, though their contents have remained a secret. Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King, went to Dorne the year after the rebellion, returned to the bones of Prince Luwin Martell, and sat down with Doran, the Prince of Dorne, and the older brother of Elia and Oberyn. During his stay in Sunspear, Jon was questioned closely regarding the fates of Elia and her children, and 100 others were questioned as well. While all talk of war ended in Dorne after Jon's visit, Dorne continued to plot a Targaryen restoration in secret, working closely together